Um, yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I've heard so much about the PG Cert, and everything happening in Exeter just seems very cool at the moment. So it's nice to be here. I've seen lots of the previous colloquium talks. So yeah, thanks for having me. It feels quite funny, everyone angled this way with the slides that way. I think we organized the name of this talk back in maybe April or even earlier. So I named it Quantifying and Cultivating Psychedelic Preparedness, a Systematic Approach to Meditation-Based Interventions. And then in the last few weeks when I've been putting it together, I've tried to stick to this title, but systematic might be a bit of a generous adjective. But generally speaking, I'm going to speak all about preparedness, as Leo mentioned. Is this working? There we go. So the need to prepare. I think most people would agree that in general, in life, a lot of things benefit from preparation. It allows us to kind of make the most from a lot of experiences, whether it's preparing for an exam or going on holiday or making a piece of art. Preparation feels more than just a responsibility sometimes. It actually profoundly impacts the experience and it can shape it. So even before we even look at psychedelics, if you take, for example, an artist, they will have a certain vision for the piece of art. They'll have a concept, and there'll be some flexibility there, obviously allowing for certain things to pop up. They'll need certain tools to be able to create the piece of art. They'll need some materials. Maybe they'll bring some pieces of inspiration or some references. You'll probably have some kind of backup plan in case things don't really go exactly as planned from the vision. But most importantly, you kind of have to trust the process. There's an element of kind of losing control or surrender to the experience. And that's true for art. And I think a similar thing, as we know, is true for a psychedelic experience. Preparation doesn't just set the stage for the experience. We think of it as something that can maximize the benefits, or whatever you want to call them, and essentially minimize the risk. So much of the things we might think of as preparation can sometimes not necessarily be visible. So you might think, sometimes it seems as if people are winging it. So of course you might hear of someone at a festival or for the first time kind of just took acid and actually had a brilliant time. And it might look as if they haven't prepared. But the truth is, much of the success of these outcomes may be because some kind of foundational level of preparedness, even if it is invisible. The problem is, for many individuals, especially as we see psychedelics kind of entering the mainstream, this baseline level of preparedness may not be there. And preparedness isn't kind of the exact same thing as planning. It may be this kind of latent or more invisible state. And this is true as we see them kind of coming into the mainstream. And so people want to know how to prepare, and it takes a very short kind of search of the internet. If you see multiple recreational users, people want to find answers, how to prepare. If you look at some of these, what's the proper way? What are the ways of preparing? But the thing is, unlike art, psychedelics are obviously legal. There's not much information of the best way to prepare. There's a million different blog articles kind of giving their top tips, best ways to maximize the rewards and minimize the risks. And to be honest, most of these are actually pretty good. Like, it is quite instinctive, the things we think we need to do to prepare. But the problem is there is no evidence base. There's not really a standardized way of looking at this. There's no sort of research into the best ways to prepare. So we can't really say which methods are more useful, which ones are less useful, which would be working for certain individuals, etc. And this kind of gap in research becomes quite prevalent when we look into the research, we look into the literature. So lots of papers kind of say preparation is key for maximizing some of the benefits. Some of them even say the therapeutic effects are even dependent on things like preparation in the context. But it is true, a caveat is a lot of this is really based on clinical observation. It's kind of based on direct experience, much like the users, recreational users, or the blog reports. This experience from clinical work allows this sort of intuition that preparation must be important, but we don't have a systematic evidence base as to what methods are the best. And this becomes pretty prevalent when we think about the structure of most psychedelic trials, which have this very specific designated preparation phase. Often this is just like an example structure, not specifically from a clinical trial, but you have this preparation phase, which might have like 3 or 4, this kind of an unspecified amount of preparation sessions. But the problem is it's a bit of a black box. Not only are the reporting standards not super high, so even if you read the manuals, you read the clinical trials, it's not exactly 100% laid out, but there's also no sort of systematic investigation into which aspects of that are actually directly related to kind of elements of the acute experience, enhancing the quality of the experience, as well as therapeutic outcomes. So this talk today this is kind of the 4 chapters I've named them. They're flexible names. They're not exactly 100% precise, but we're going to start by looking at measurement. So how can we actually measure and define this idea of preparedness? Then I want to look into the idea of prediction. Having created this way of measuring it, does that state actually predict aspects of the quality of the experience as well as any changes or therapeutic outcomes? The third bit I've called optimization. I don't know if optimization is the right word, but this idea of tuning it or fine-tuning or kind of selecting facets of that preparation to look at whether or not they are predictive. And then finally, we'll look at how we might then evaluate or compare different parts of this preparation. This is like a loose framework we can go through in the chapters. But yeah, we can start with preparation. Start with measurement. So yes, so one of the first studies we did was really looking at this idea of preparedness. And we wanted to create a measure of this, like a survey to be able to capture this concept. But we realized there wasn't really a strong working definition of preparedness anyway. So the first aim was to create the definition. The second was to create a validated measure. But a big driving force behind a lot of these studies has been to create these tools, not just from one person's perspective. So not just from me as a PhD student, what I think the definition is, what I think would be a good measurement, but actually including the voices of stakeholders and people with lived experience, as well as kind of other experts in the space, in order to create a more valid measure, a more valid or applicable definition, which wasn't just based on what I thought would be a definition. So a big movement in UCL especially is this thing called the co-production collective, where you actually involve stakeholders throughout the whole development of any kind of measure, any kind of intervention, etc. So that was like a active ingredient we wanted to introduce throughout basically every stage of the development. So the first stage, I asked DALL-E to create an image of a researcher with short blonde hair. So this is a very, now realized, quite a creepy image of maybe AI's version of me. But this is me in the first stage. But essentially, the first round was preliminary consultation. So that meant we interviewed experts of philosophy, psychiatry, pharmacology, psychology to try and work out what people thought was a definition of psychedelic preparedness. And equally, because we wanted to develop this measure, we wanted to gather as many items as they thought would kind of tap into this measure. So the idea at this stage is item generation. You want to gather as many items as possible, and then you slowly will prune them down to kind of create a more robust measure. The next stage of this paper was what we called the DELFO method. So this is essentially, again, it's about item generation. And so we have these 4 rounds of Delphi, where Delphi is essentially, they use it a lot in commercial settings, not so much in research, but it's kind of a consensus generation process. So on each round, you ask experts, or you ask the people you're interested in to give their feedback on certain items. You synthesize the results, and then iteratively you go through further rounds until you can reach consensus on the items. And so that was what we did with the experts, a new round of experts. But in between those, we interspersed them with focus groups with people with lived experience of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So these were 8 people who had been on a previous clinical trial, various different clinical trials around the UK. And so by interspersing them, we eventually...
Your slides are not moving.
So I can carry on speaking because it's just... So essentially, we wanted to get the voices of the experts as well as the experts by experience. So each round we could kind of see, in the first round we started, is that working? Yeah. So the first round we started, you can see at the top here, with 59 items. And then through the DALFO, they kind of generated more and more items, but then they pruned them down again. And so the idea is to reach consensus on the largest, on the final items within the actual survey. And then finally, before actually administering it to a large online population, we ran qualitative pretest interviews, or QPIs, which are essentially, this was with another round of lived experience participants, is essentially you give participants the items and you ask them to do a kind of think aloud process. So they do it a lot within questionnaire development. And it's the idea that they kind of say what they're thinking as they're answering it. Does it make sense? Does it need to be reworded? And I think at this stage we changed, made modifications to 4 items. So following this process, we had a working definition of psychedelic preparedness and the initial list of lots of items which were pruned down, but the aim was to then implement them on a large online survey where you would do even more item reduction analysis. So the working definition of psychedelic preparedness was, we can think of it as a state preceding the psychedelic session that is conducive to a safe and personally meaningful experience. And individuals in this state will likely be psychologically, physically, and socially ready, not just for the content of the experience, but also the consequences or any changes as a result of the experience. And then finally, it's likely going to include a variety of extra pharmacological factors. So having got these items, we then administered it to a large online survey. And the aim of this was to test the validity and the reliability. So validity being a measure of kind of accuracy, and reliability being a measure of consistency, both within itself and also over time. So like over a 2-week interval. And so we administered it online, and we administered it to 2 separate surveys, 2 separate samples. Overall, the sample was over 1,000, but the first sample was just over 500. And having administered all of the items, well, the 51 items, we then ran an EFA, which is an exploratory factor analysis, which is essentially, it's a data-driven approach to look at how those items kind of cluster together based on their shared variance. So you can look at these sort of latent variables, these hidden ways in which the data naturally falls into categories. And so after doing this EFA, the data looked like it fell into these 4 latent structures, which we then labeled based on the items within them. We then did a CFA on the next sample, which is a confirmatory factor analysis, which is essentially when you take that model that you just got from the EFA and then you test it on the new data to see whether or not your data fits that model you just hypothesized. And we found that it had a good fit. And within that process, you also essentially, there's methods for dropping items, whether they don't load onto a factor very well, or if they have a really high cross-loading on 2 items. And so what we found is that 20 items were retained within this process, and they could easily fall into these 4 factors, which were correlated together but independent. And you can see based on the items within them, you can label them. So we named this first one knowledge expectation. And so this factor is really about individuals having realistic expectations for the experience. So having some psychoeducation, having knowledge about it, knowing what to expect, having done some of their own research, etc. The next factor, psychophysical readiness. This one taps into, you can look at the items, it's this sort of state of being ready to surrender to what the experience will be, trusting the process, and also being prepared for not only the kind of psychological effects, but also the physical effects of the psychedelic. The third one, intention preparation, this one's really about having an intention, carefully contemplating the reasons for the experience, maybe speaking to people about that experience, or about those intentions for the experience. And then finally, support planning. This is about essentially feeling safe, having a trusting relationship with the people around you, preparing some strategies for if things get challenging, etc. And so what's cool about these processes is we had these kind of items, they were generated through all these different methods. And then by applying these either data-driven or confirmatory approaches, they clustered quite nicely, and the clusters make sense based on how they clustered together. So this is kind of the 4-factor model we then rolled with through various different studies. And so you can think of the preparedness as these 4 factors or as a total scale. And so in this part of the study, we thought of it in terms of total scale. So all of those items, a level of preparedness. And we found that on this online survey, retrospectively speaking, so this was at one time point, and they were looking back to, I think we said, your most significant psychedelic experience or something like that. So we're looking at one specific psychedelic experience. We found that there was a positive correlation between level of preparedness and level of mystical experience. So the more prepared someone is, the higher they scored on the mystical experience questionnaire. And then on the flip side, we found a negative correlation between preparedness and challenging psychedelic experience. And these are pretty high correlations in the world of psychometrics. And we also found there was a positive correlate. So this is kind of, again, looking at the acute experience, a positive correlation between emotional breakthrough during the experience, so that cathartic release. And then finally, this S-WEBS, this is the short Warwick and Edinburgh wellbeing questionnaire. Essentially, we asked them to rate how much did they change in well-being as a result of the experience. So it's like a retrospective measure of change in well-being. And there was a positive correlation there. So this was cool, but it was also retrospective, and obviously there's limitations to how accurately people can report on that. So we then ran another study, this time using a prospective version of the questionnaire, so asking people to do it before they had their psychedelic experience. And this was with one of our collaborating retreat centers. And we found pretty similar results. You can look at the graphs. This is a global, this is just all of the 5D ASE factors actually combined together. It'd be interesting to kind of split them up into their 5 factors, but this is just essentially looking at the intensity of the experience. But this is what's actually quite interesting. This time we were looking at change in depression, anxiety, and stress as measured before and after. So you can look at the change scores. And we found there was a relationship between decreases in depression, decreases anxiety, and decreases in stress with this level of preparedness. So this was cool. This was like a nice way in which we developed the scale and validated it on a prospective and a retrospective sample. And so then we wanted to see whether or not we could use the scale in other settings. And so this was another study we ran earlier this year, and this was a naturalistic study of 5-MeO-DMT. And it was various things involved. The main point was actually to look at the EEG data from the 5-MeO experience, which George recently had his preprint on. And so if anyone is very interested in the EEG stuff, definitely speak to George in the pub later, because I'm sure he would like to wax lyrical about those results. Or if you're shy, you can read the paper here. There's a preprint up. But yeah, essentially the point was to collect this EEG data, but also since we were running this study, we collected lots of survey data, questionnaire, cognitive task, etc., all within this kind of design. What we're going to focus on now is the survey, specifically the one we just developed. Oh yeah, but before going into it, I just thought, does anyone not know what 5-MeO-DMT is? Okay, some people. Yes, so I just thought 5-MeO-DMT is quite, like many people don't know what 5-MeO-DMT is because there's not much research on it. So just very briefly, I thought I'd talk about some of the subjective effects. So 5-MeO-DMT is a super short lasting psychedelic, a bit like DMT, but very different in terms of the subjective experience. And so you can, this was James. I think James has done maybe works on some of the PG cert. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So James, yeah, he's a microphenomenology person. And he came with us out to Mexico and did some interviews with people afterwards. And we also piloted this new questionnaire that he kind of developed based on these interviews. And they're now using it at Imperial too on their clinical trial. But here you can see some of the data, and I think it's quite nice. I just plotted it out on this graph because you can start to get an idea of what these experiences are like. And we also asked them in like 2 or 3 sentences to describe the peak of their experience, which you can see here. And so it's one of those experiences which, if you look here at the higher scoring ones, it's really people experience something pure, no sense of time, losing all awareness of my body, this idea of non-duality. It's also known as the God molecule. It's like super intense, very quick experience. And so you can see from these reports, there's this idea of love, unity, evolution. It's dissolving into a white space. So it's very, there's a crossover here between what we think of the oceanic boundlessness or the mystical experience. And so just a quick word cloud of some of those reports. You can see there's this idea of collapsing, full, everything, nothing, etc. And then when we ran the 5D ASC, this standard measure for looking at altered states of consciousness, you could just see there's this like insanely high OBN score. So people are experiencing what we call oceanic boundlessness. So in the survey questionnaires, we applied the PPS, and I wanted to see whether or not it was predictive of certain states. And based on those 4 factors, the psychophysical readiness factor was predictive of oceanic boundlessness. And so just as a reminder, some of the items that were in that factor, it's this idea of trusting your body, being ready. It's this state of readiness for surrender, this physical side, psychological side, you're ready to experience whatever came up. And I don't think this isn't that shocking, right? It makes sense that if they were ready to experience this, they felt open to it, then that was going to be predictive of having a sort of deeper, richer, oceanic boundless experience. And these ideas are not new. Like many researchers have spoken about this idea of pre-states leading to states, etc. And I think this psychophysical readiness factor really taps into this idea of a pre-state. It's a state preceding the experience, which seems to, it's almost like you're ready to experience this. Over and above the 3 other factors, I think the psychophysical readiness one really does align with this sort of model. And so in addition to the surveys, we also included some experience sampling. So Joe, another person in our lab, created this Telegram bot, which essentially for 7 days before and 7 days after their experience would give them 2 ping, like notifications a day, and it would ask them to just report on what they were doing. I can't remember the specific prompt, but if you're interested, I can ask her. But essentially it was, what's on your mind, or what have you been doing? But the point was to kind of not specifically ask a question about your preparedness, but more get some general ramblings, get an idea of what they were saying, because then we were able to apply certain natural language processing techniques to kind of look at whether or not aspects of their language were indicative of a certain state that would be predictive of the experience. So this is just a kind of screenshot from the bot. You'd send your voice note, it would respond. She's done loads of research with this kind of bot-based format, and it's been very, very interesting. People like interacting with the bot. She had like a whole therapy bot, etc. It's kind of crazy. So yeah, we received over nearly 300 voice recordings. It was a nice big data set. And one way to look at this is using the first kind of thing we do, which is really simple, is looking at Loop, which is a linguistic software, which essentially is a software made up of lots of different lists of words or dictionaries based on certain themes. So Joe's very interested in looking at certain cognitive things and affective things. But in the context of this, Millie actually led this bit of the research. We were looking at whether or not there's sort of something to do with this state of psychophysical readiness or preparedness. And what we found was words within this mindfulness dictionary were predictive of oceanic boundlessness. So essentially, the dictionary or the list of words would have multiple dozens of words associated with mindfulness, and we found that those who used them more, or certain combinations of words which fed into which were indicated by this dictionary, that was predictive of oceanic boundlessness. And what's interesting is this is kind of it's gathering this data over the 7 days. It's not just a one-off response. Questionnaires are we like questionnaires. We're developing a questionnaire, but they're obviously limited in that they're capturing a certain experience in that moment. Whereas this is interesting because it's over a state of time. It's over a state of time. And we can start to think about things that are maybe slightly less explicit. It's almost a covert way of tapping into certain states. So that was the Luke, but it is quite a simple way of deconstructing voice notes. Another method we used, or Joe is using Roberta. So Roberta is a transformer-based model. It's a bit like GPT, but an old version. And this, we trained it on the Go emotions data set, which is essentially 27 different emotions. And I put a few examples here, but essentially you have a sentence, and then within that sentence, it gives you a rating for all of those 27 different emotions, with a total coming to 1. So it splits it up between those 27 emotions. And this is really good because it does take into context the meaning of the sentence, the context of the sentence, any negations, etc. Whereas with Luke, it kind of just gives you a score based on the words involved. So I just put an example here. So these are absolutely made up. None of our participants said this. I wish they would say this. But the first one, this was a very positive, fake person. I'm thrilled about the upcoming research project in Mexico where I'll take 5-MeO and have my brain scanned. It's a once-in-a-lifetime chance to dive into unexplored territories of consciousness and contributed groundbreaking science. This scored super high in excitement, and then followed by joy, a bit of neutral, admiration, approval. So you can see it's kind of, and it does all 27, I just didn't screenshot them. Okay, then this example is taking more of a tentative, I'm a bit curious about the experience. It could reveal some fascinating insights. This one scored high on curiosity, excitement, a little bit of confusion, etc. And then finally, again, the same idea. They're using very similar words, but this one, I'm a bit apprehensive about the project. This is a bit intimidating, not sure how intense it will be. We see some fear, nervousness, confusion, etc. So you can see we did this essentially for every sentence they used, and then created a weighted mean score for everyone before their experience. We then performed a PCA on all of the emotion scores. So a PCA is a principal components analysis, a bit like the EFA and CFA we mentioned before. It's essentially a way of reducing the data into smaller components based on the overall variance explained. So say we have 27 emotions, it basically says, what's a simpler way of clustering them together? And when we did this based on the data, it kind of spat out 9 components, which explained 85.8% of the variance. And what's interesting is the first component, which was made up of gratitude, pride, and joy, higher scores on gratitude, pride, and joy, and lower scores on disapproval, confusion, and disappointment, this component was significantly predictive of psychedelic preparedness as well as changes in well-being. So this is Jo, literally, we did this. She showed me this last week. So she's definitely still kind of pruning this, but hopefully there'll be a preprint out by the end of the year. But it's just the point being, there's different ways of exploring these pre-states. It doesn't all just have to be questionnaire-based. Experience sampling, looking at language in ways which can allow us to kind of look at more overt and covert ways of exploring these pre-states. But going back to this model, we obviously have this idea of a pre-state. But I think as we start to track things beyond just a kind of simple standalone snapshot measurement, we can also start to think about whether or not this is actually sort of sliding into the traits category or arena. This is particularly true when we go back to this model, because of course there are certain states within this. We're all leading up to this final pre-state before the dosing. But we know that preparation for many people, whether it's in a clinical trial, whether it's outside of the clinic, whether it's at a retreat center, can often last weeks, if not months. And so we have to start thinking about whether or not these things we're doing within preparation, these facets of preparation, are impacting just states or also impacting traits. So traits would be things that are thought of as more long-term, so things like personality traits. But this is a quote from a systematic review by Thal et al. So this was a systematic review of preparatory methods in substance-assisted psychotherapy. This is something that I think is true. So it's impossible to draw definitive conclusions regarding the significance and impact of specific facets of preparatory sessions on therapeutic outcomes. So even if these things that they're doing within preparation are impacting traits or states, because we don't have much of an evaluation, because they're not reported super clearly, because there's a real lack of evidence, we can't really say specific things. So this is kind of based on these kind of ideas. We wanted to then we wanted to do more research to tap into the idea or ask, what are the things that are changing? What facets are people finding useful? How are these leading to certain outcomes? Are they leading to traits? Are they leading to states, etc.? So the next study we did was a qualitative study. And there's a big long qualitative report, which I doubt anyone really wants to read. So you can, if you want to read it in the real paper, but it can really be summarized within this model. So essentially we ran qualitative interviews, again, with some participants who had previously been through psychedelic therapy. And the aim of these interviews, the first part of the interviews, to ask them, what did you do to prepare? And essentially, what did it do? So what impact did it have? Was it useful, etc.? To unpack which facets of preparation are kind of leading to which outcomes and whether or not they're useful. So when we were analyzing the data, we wanted to bring forward that 4-factor model from that first paper in a deductive way. So you can see here, these are the 4 factors from that first paper, but then inductively, we generated some sub-themes within each of those categories. And then within each of those sub-themes, we found certain outcomes were associated with those sub-themes. And what's interesting is that specific activities seem to be associated with specific sub-themes. So I can just give an example because it will make a little bit more sense. So if we look at the knowledge expectation main theme, within that, we see the sub-theme of subjective effects. So knowledge expectation is about having realistic expectations, doing some psychoeducation. And so the subjective effects sub-theme would mean reading about the subjective effects or learning more about the subjective effects through various different methods. So then when we look to the activities associated with it, obviously it kind of seems intuitive. The highest rated one was reading, followed by things like podcasts, videos, etc. And so when you look at the quotes of what outcomes were associated with performing these activities, one of them was that they facilitated decision-making process. So you can see one of these quotes, knowing what to expect helped me make a decision about whether this was something for me right now. If we look at another example, so say we're looking at the psychophysical readiness main theme, within that there's a sub-theme of present awareness, and we have some activities associated with that sub-theme. So things like open monitoring meditation, journaling, and mindful walking. So essentially, participating in those activities led to certain outcomes, one of them being an increased capacity for participants to observe their thoughts. So you can look at an example here. We might see it was like a little peg just dropping off the thoughts in one room and letting me move on to the next. So we started to gain an understanding of what facets of preparation people were doing, what kind of outcomes they were leading to, how this kind of linked into these 4 factors we were thinking about previously. And then another thing we did within the interview is just really explicitly ask them, what preparation strategies do you think were most effective for you? And by and large, most people voted for meditation, followed by reading, a bit of journaling, conversations, etc. We also asked, I don't know if you can read, that might be a bit small, but I can read out the top ones. We also asked them about what were the biggest hurdles in preparation. So what were the hardest things to kind of do? Or what were the biggest barriers for them preparing? And the highest response was information overload. So having too much information, not really sure where to get their resources from. Time constraints, problems with intention setting. Some said motivation and boredom, etc. And this one was interesting. When we asked them, what would you do if you were to participate in another psychedelic experience? Most of them said, next time round, I would do more meditation. They try and set their intentions more clearly. They do some journaling, but it was this idea, lots of things were pointing to meditation. And finally, we asked, where would you want some additional guidance? And again, there was a mix of responses, but the highest one being coping strategies. So more information and strategies, how to help with coping. Oh, this was almost like a bit of market research. We also asked them at the end, okay, so if we were to develop some kind of intervention, do you think it would be okay if it was online or not online, etc.? Most of them have voted it was fine for online. And then when we asked them about certain parameters for preparation in terms of duration, there was a big range, but many of them said around 30 minutes and for 21 days. We asked them lots of other questions as well. There's various other graphs, but these are the ones that I think were quite relevant for the talk today. So having done those qualitative interviews, the final stage of this paper was to then run some co-design workshops. So we ran 3 different co-design workshops. I won't go into the specific details, but essentially they were also at our collaborating retreat centers. So we had all of these elements of preparation. We then wanted to refine them. So we ran first workshop, which was to prioritize which components to include. The second one was to refine them. And the third one was kind of to evaluate them. And based on these interviews, the previous research, and those co-design workshops, we came up with this structure and the thematic modules for a digital intervention for psychedelic preparedness. So what you can see here is we've taken forward the 4 factors from the first paper and kind of spread them out. So the intention preparation factor runs continuously throughout the 21 days. So just to contextualize this a bit, here is the start. It would last 21 days, the end of the 21 days being a dosing. So the intention preparation factor runs throughout. And this essentially means there's journaling every day. There's journaling related to certain phases of the preparation for participants to do every day. And they start with the knowledge expectation factor. Again, they have weekly activities associated with this. And this would essentially be things like psychoeducation, reading, watching videos to really allow them to have a realistic expectation and understanding and foundational knowledge of what to expect. Then they move into the second week, which is psychophysical readiness. The activities associated with this would mainly be kind of grounding exercises. And finally, safety planning. The activities associated with this in the last week would be preparing personalized coping strategies, as well as preparing integration. But what's kind of the most intensive part of this would be the meditation that happens every day. So this is something that gradually increases in duration, followed by a mood assessment, which they gradually increase in kind of time and depth leading up to the psychedelic experience. So this is very much a meditation-based intervention based on that sort of co-production user feedback from the stakeholders previously. So there's big focus on meditation, but anyone who's studied meditation or is a practitioner knows that meditation is it's not just one thing. You can't just say, brilliant, just meditate. It means many different things. There's many different practices, there's many different schools, etc. And it's kind of a black box just to say, do meditation. It's interesting because there is actually a lot of talk of meditation at the moment. Obviously, there's this big wave in psychedelic conversation, but at the same time, some researchers have called this the third wave of meditation research. So in the 70s, there kind of was this first wave where they were looking at mental health benefits of meditation. Then at the turn of the century, we would see more mechanistic work. And then now we're looking into kind of more advanced states of meditation, whether that's kind of self-transcendence or non-dual. And there's a lot of media attention, there's a lot of research, etc. So this third wave seems to be a thing. And what's interesting is there has been various pieces of research looking at the kind of striking similarity between the phenomenology of psychedelic experiences, certain psychedelic experiences, and certain states of meditation. There's also been an interest in combining them, but a lot of the research has been either about combining them during the acute experience or potentially as a form of integration afterwards. There hasn't really been much research looking at the use of meditation as a tool before the experience, particularly for people who haven't really trained in either meditation or had much experience in psychedelics. So this was sort of a surprising gap, given the similarities between not only the development of research within the field, but also the subjective experiences. So the reason meditation could be really interesting when we think about this model is because, okay, if we look at this pre-state section, meditation has shown, loads of research has shown for it to almost immediately improve mood. It can reduce anxiety, increase state mindfulness. So this very much like in the moment, pre-state assessment, even doing a short amount of meditation may just generally improve mood, increase baseline readiness. Then when we think about traits, various forms of meditation have shown specifically to impact absorption, openness, and acceptance, which just so happen to specifically be shown to be predictors of the quality of psychedelic experience. But I think this is definitely something I need to think more about. And so I would like to speak about this if anyone also has any ideas. But essentially, beyond just kind of this, not superficial per se, but kind of obvious pre-state and state impact, there's obviously something similar about the architecture of certain subjective experiences within meditation, as well as the psychedelic experience. So on a cognitive or computational neurobiological level, if we're experiencing something similar to a certain degree and being able to enter those states beforehand, there's a high chance this may be able to prime the mind and or brain into entering those states at another time, i.e. on the psychedelic. So on various levels, this could be a useful tool of preparation, not only for the idea of on an experiential level, it might be less scary, but also on a kind of capacity level to be able to enter those states with slightly more ease, having almost kind of massaged those architectures beforehand or loosened them to a certain extent to be able to enter them. And so I haven't got a formal computational model here, but it makes sense to assume that this could be some kind of priming effect. So there's a kind of case for meditation, but there's still not really an exploration as to, okay, what type of meditation? So the next study we did was kind of specifically to answer this question. Again, working under this kind of ingredient of co-production or including the voices of people who know better than I do, we recruited over 100 experienced meditators with psychedelic experience. So you can look at the demographics here. Many of them were kind of meditating every single day for over 45 minutes. Many of them had over 10 years of experience and over 20 psychedelic experiences. And the aim of this paper was essentially to look at the perceived impact of meditation training on psychedelic preparedness. So generally first looking at meditation, and then specifically looking at whether or not they had opinions on whether certain practices in meditation, certain skills, certain competencies would be more or less beneficial for the psychedelic experience. So just generally talking about meditation at this point, it's not going into certain practices. Most of them agreed across various dimensions that training and meditation beforehand would be useful for the psychedelic experience. So you can see across the over 100 participants, they're scoring pretty high on this idea that's going to help insights, contribute to a safe experience, derive lasting benefits, help access meditative states, etc. There's generally high scorings out of 10. We also asked them how they thought training and meditation would impact certain dimensions of the psychedelic experience using the 5D ASE. And you can see they didn't really think it would impact most of the dimensions, maybe a little bit of a reduction in anxious ego dissolution, but most of them really thought it would impact this oceanic boundlessness factor, which makes sense given everything we've kind of been speaking about. Whereas the other ones, okay, a little bit of an increase in visual reconstruction and auditory awareness, but it's mainly this oceanic boundlessness. But what was most useful, especially as we went forward to try and develop the intervention, was some of these questions relating more to the different practices. Now, this is one way, so we asked them essentially, which meditation practice do you think would be most beneficial to train in as part of psychedelic preparedness? And this way of taxonomizing meditation is super reductive. Like, it is something we do in the literature using loving kindness, open awareness, self-transcendent, and focused attention, but it is limited because in reality, there's a big crossover between many of the competencies trained across these different practices. But this is fine for now. And what we found is the highest scores went to loving kindness. And this might seem quite surprising because many of the more advanced forms of meditation are really looking at training this idea of one-pointed concentration or focused attention practices, where you can essentially focus your attention so sharply on a specific object or an idea that eventually you can enter absorption states and dharana states, etc. So I think we were pretty open-minded as to what they would say, but we thought there would be a higher rating for this kind of focused attention. But really, focused attention was rated the lowest by these expert meditators. And this idea of open awareness or loving kindness seemed to be scoring higher. And so when we think about what loving kindness is, so loving kindness practice is also known as metta in Pali, but essentially the practice involves cultivating goodwill, benevolence, and friendly feelings, first towards yourself, eventually towards other people, and eventually into all six directions. The translation actually, although we call it loving kindness, it more directly translates to friendliness or benevolence. But essentially, it's this idea of cultivating metta. Metta can sometimes be described as that feeling of when they're teaching it to new practitioners, it's about either using affirmations such as may I be happy, may I be well, etc., or focusing on that kind of warm, fuzzy feeling you might get when like looking at a puppy or seeing a cute, chubby baby. So cultivating it in whatever way, and then eventually allowing it to really develop and expand. And research has shown that this form of meditation has led to positive emotions, increased mood, etc. But what's interesting is this research has shown that it has been shown to counteract the hedonic treadmill effect, which is essentially when a lot of interventions do increase mood, but there's often a reversion back down to baseline after a certain amount of time. But with metta meditation or loving kindness, there seems to be a kind of slow upward trend, obviously with fluctuations, towards a higher baseline state of well-being. And what's interesting is that when you train in metta or loving kindness to a certain level, you can start to enter these boundless states. So a boundless mind. And this is the idea when you move beyond radiating it towards yourself, towards other people, to the six directions, it can enter a state somewhat similar to the oceanic boundlessness state, and eventually into these advanced absorption states. And the focus or the anchor, the home base of meditation being this kind, warm feeling, rather than just a specific focused attention, is what many of the practitioners at the end, through kind of their qualitative reports, said was one of the reasons why it would probably be most useful, because you're able to enter these states of absorption and boundlessness, but with an anchor of positivity or warmth or metta. And there's quite a lot of research looking specifically at loving kindness meditation and neural fMRI studies looking at decreased self-referential processing, so reductions in the default mode network, which may be similar to some of the research within the psychedelic space. So we looked at another question where this one was looking at specific skills or like specific components that individuals will kind of learn through meditation. And we asked them to rate which ones would be most useful. So beyond just kind of the big category of loving kindness. And we found that the highest rating actually here, it looks like curiosity, but if we look at this mean, we can look, it is actually sense of humor. So this curiosity, sense of humor, comfort with discomfort, empathy and compassion, these are the ones which was rated way more highly than these lower ones. And these skills were developed in collaboration with some of the expert meditation practitioners from the Harvard Meditation Research Program. They had multiple years, decades of experience, and they came up with kind of a selection of components and skills which would kind of traverse various different practices. And this, I just found this quite cute, that sense of humor was rated the highest amongst various other ones. And I think it's important to remember that sense of humor, it doesn't just mean finding the situation funny or like being silly. Within particularly Zen Buddhism, sense of humor is seen as a very serious practice. And it's not about just laughing at something. It's really about seeing the absurdity and the kind of inconsistencies between kind of perception and experience, and finding the amusement, finding curiosity within those kind of inconsistencies. And in a way, it taps into this idea of predictions, sort of approaching predictions with a sense of curiosity and kindness and almost laughter, rather than kind of being freaked out by the idea that these things are inconsistent. But essentially, we ran a EFA on this as well, just to kind of look at whether there were some underlying factors. And we found that these items that loaded together on what we called a positive emotional state, so these were kind of things like sense of humor, positive emotion cultivation, etc. Over and above, this was mindful awareness and insight, and this was concentration techniques. These positive emotional states were rated as the highest, which isn't super surprising. Oh, I just included this here because we asked a very similar question that we did to the participants about the parameters for what they thought would be useful for a digital intervention. And we found really, really similar results. So the idea of around 21 days for around 31 minutes, and most of them said online and asynchronous would be useful. So given all of this data from kind of different angles and pathways, we wanted to gather as much as we could before we made this intervention. And so then we made this intervention, the Digital Intervention for Psychedelic Preparedness, or we call it DIPP, and it includes all of the research from these different findings. So we have the 4-factor preparedness from the original study. We have the meditation based on loving kindness. We have these mood check-ins, and we try to include as many of the ideas from the stakeholders as well as the experts. So experts by experience as well as experts into the final architecture of this. And we're now piloting, well, hopefully come January, we're going to be piloting this at UCL. And so they'll be doing this for the 21 days, having various measurements around this as the intervention. So hopefully, if I see you all in a year from now, I'll have more interesting to say about whether or not it actually worked. But yeah, thank you. I don't know how I am for half time. I have no more slides, but yeah, if anyone has any questions or thoughts, they are very welcome. Yes.
What's the physical state of people when they're in a 5-MeO DMT experience? And is there any sort of somatic influence over the state that they're in? Are they very passive, or what's happening? And do they remember that, or is that any part of the experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it's very interesting. Essentially, for this study, we wanted to, so before even that, on 5-MeO, the experience can be incredibly dynamic. So for some people, they may remain completely still. For some people, there might just be kind of some rhythmic breathing or slight kind of chanting. And for some people, it can be full somatic release all around the room, rolling around, screaming, primal screaming. It's a huge variety, but most people would have a more dynamic experience, especially first timers. But for this study, because we were doing EEG, we wanted to recruit people who knew that they stayed still, because for EEG, it's impossible if they're rolling around the room doing backflips. So we did a huge screening criteria, and we wanted to recruit people who, the retreat center we collaborated with, they call them Buddha sitters. So we were looking for Buddha sitters. And so we had interviews with them, and many of these people had done it 300 times. And so that was the aim. But even then, with the 30 people we recruited, every single experience is completely different. So even within that sample, we saw people moving all around the room. We saw people kind of really, really screaming and moving through things. Luckily, the majority were still, and we were able to use them. But some people who had used 5-MeO, worked with it for years, they still, within a second of inhaling, ripped off the headset. They just were done. And they had no memory of it. And this is coming to the second part of your question. When you come to, say, 10 minutes back, you're in the room, you don't have any memory of what you're doing. So we had this one participant who was super well experienced, had done multiple practices in the lead up to the session, videoed himself for it. When it came to actually doing it, he said, "Do you mind if I video myself?" And we said, "Well, it's up to you. You can if you want." And so after doing it, he came out, and we were speaking to him after at lunch, and he was like, "Oh, I'm not going to watch the video because obviously it's really boring. I didn't move." And we just looked at him like, "You might be in for a surprise." So he had absolutely no idea. He wasn't doing anything super dynamic, but there was a lot of talking and moving and kind of, which he was completely unaware of. So Yeah, it's very unpredictable. I think if experienced facilitators probably have some eye for it based on people's dynamic and personality, whether or not they're going to be very dynamic. But we saw pretty much a lot more, the whole range of experiences, I would say.
Just following up on that question, I'm curious, were any of these people who did the 5-year advanced meditators as well?
So we had.
Sorry, just to follow up that one. If they were advanced meditators, did they meditate first?
So we had a couple of people, I think one particularly stood out as someone who had only done 5-MeO a few times, but prior to that had only really discovered psychedelics later on in his life. Before that was a pretty advanced meditator. And what they, from the outside, those who did more meditation, there was also, I would say, 2 who were pretty advanced meditators. They were completely still. They were completely still the entire time, had incredibly peaceful, deep experiences, no dynamic kind of outward expression, which isn't always indicative, usually isn't necessarily indicative of what's happening on the inside, but they particularly had incredibly deep experiences. And what one of them said was it was somewhat similar to the jhana states that they were experiencing for like 20 years in the lead up to it.
Like, what's happening, unlike the person who was
Aware, what do you mean aware?
aware within the 5-year experience, because what you're saying is the other person wasn't aware of what they were doing, but they're aware of the physical and mental movements.
I couldn't tell because I haven't done the micro. James might be able to, if we look into them, whether or not they were aware they were still in the experiment. But most people on 5-MeO absolutely would just, for at least 7 minutes, not be in this space. You're not aware of your body. You're not aware of the room, time, space, anything. And then eventually you come back. So they wouldn't have been aware of the actual experience of them being on the bed in the room. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, kind of, but yeah, but in meditative states you can do that.
Well, I think it would be a super interesting follow-up question because we didn't really look at that, because that study was before we were looking specifically at the meditation component. It wasn't something we asked about, but I think it would be incredibly important to explore the similarities and differences between those full release experiences and whether or not aware. I think the word aware is a bit tricky in that context, right? Because what do we mean aware? But
like, you're, and of course, about the feel like mine. You are aware, even though you're in deep sleep. So that awakeness, you're awake and you remember it all, and you know that this is correct. So that's very.
I think it's definitely something to be explored. But the one thing I would say is for many of those, the one person I am thinking about, there was a massive gap in memory, and that was obviously only one experience without the intention necessarily to recall, but. Basically, absolutely, that needs to be researched, like directly comparing the phenomenology of not only the advanced meditative states, but also the 5-MeO and also those with the experience in advanced meditative states entering the 5-MeO state. I think I don't know.
You started looking at like a false sense of preparedness. It seems like a lot of challenging psychedelic experiences can be fueled by like confidence in what they're doing. But yeah, like in either questionnaires or analysis of language, or if you could find red flags or patterns of people potentially going into it through overconfidence and thinking they're prepared and they're not.
I think that's a really good question. I haven't looked into it specifically, but I think going just kind of intuitively, like whenever we're doing our screening for the trials, etc. When we had the training with the clinical psychologist, obviously you ask people about why they're doing it, whether they're ready. And one of the biggest kind of red flags is if someone has this sort of super confident, not scared at all, not quite the subtle sense of fear that is actually a part of preparedness, right? So I definitely think there's legs to that. I'm not sure how we would specifically explore it, but I do think maybe something like the natural language processing could be a cool way to do it, especially if you have an idea of maybe what kind of features you're looking for, like warning signs essentially, and then using it as almost a screening tool. But I haven't looked into it yet, but I think it's a really cool area to explore. Yeah, exactly. Immediately out.
Thanks, David. Of course. Are you looking into any other behaviours, activities associated with psychedelic preparedness or integration? And statistically, I'm sure there's a way. Statistically, how do you take into account kind of polarizing experiences? You know, they say on commercial radio they don't play 1 out of 5 records or 5 out of 5 records. Same applies to 5 out of 5. So statistically, how do you take over all those?
So the first question was, are there other methods that we're looking at? So I'm not, well, for this trial, actually, the control is music listening. So we have 21 days of meditation training with the app, and then the control will be 21 days of the exact same thing, but rather than having the audio guided meditations, it's a music listening control, so that it can have the same amount of preparation. Because it literally might just be, if you spend 21 days preparing for anything, setting intentions, being there, even thinking about it, maybe that's maybe that's enough. Yeah, I mean, honestly, in the first interviews, 3 people mentioned their best, like the most recommended thing would be this Alan Watts YouTube video. I was like, I don't need to make this whole intervention. I could just give them a link.
I'll speak about it once.
Yes, that should be the 3rd control. Just a nice AI generated Alan Watts.
You're going to expand into the trait emotional intelligence question. Right,
I don't think like meditation is the one way to prepare. I think I'm super interested specifically in that kind of thing I alluded to earlier about this idea of potentially priming the mind to be able to be more ready for the experience. So I think I'm interested in the meditation, but I definitely think there's things like diet that would be super cool to look at, whether or not a certain amount of like certain types of food impacted whether or not you were ready. Things like more movement-based practices, yoga, exercise, all of these things are so obviously going to help someone be in a generally better state. And I think the list goes on. Obviously, if you had unlimited funding and unlimited time and unlimited help, you could do an amazing multifactorial design and isolate these people and keep them doing only that one practice. Because in reality, people are doing many, many things. You can't really control for them all. So I think the step forward at this stage would be just to at least collect the data on what other people are doing, especially the qualitative data about whether they thought there was something even more important they were doing or what they attributed to certain levels of readiness, if it wasn't just the meditation or the music listening. Say again? Yes. Varied, yeah. Yes, they were passive, but what would be more active? Yes, I guess there was mindful walking. Yeah. No. I think I know what you mean. I think they're also quite like secular science-y. These are kind of tangible, simple things you can do. And I think, yeah, obviously doing art, journal, all of these things are going to be the more holistic your preparation, I essentially think will be the better type of preparation. But it just shows there's way more research to be done. This is just like a snapshot of some of the things we found from a very specific certain population. But even just, and this is also data driven from those stakeholders, even something like a more theoretical account, even just coming up with ideas, not necessarily based on kind of 8 people said this, 4 people said that, would be a super useful piece of research to kind of do.
Thank you. I was really struck, it was towards the beginning of your talk, when you were asking people what they thought they should have done to prepare, and meditation was their kind of number one go-to thing, which struck me as very culturally specific. And I'm sure you can't answer this because you'd need to replicate the experiment in other cultures. But for example, in Gabon, the way to prepare for your iboga initiation is to take a very powerful emetic and vomit and clear everything out. So I'm curious about the cultural specificity of this. That in the West, meditation, psychedelics, oceanic boundlessness, they all exist in the imagination. What do you think would happen if you ran this in Gabon?
I completely agree. This is a very, even though we tried to include stakeholders, it's super, super specific. And I think absolutely, especially with this kind of hype in meditation as well, people think, oh, I've heard about that, I probably should have done that as well. And I also think another confound is people have the psychedelic experience, and that also impacts whether or not they want to meditate. And then most people, many people, particularly at these retreat centers, then start taking up meditation. So of course, it's biased retrospectively because you think, oh, this is great, I can access these states. What would I have done before? So I totally agree, it's very specific. And I think absolutely this whole thing is very much based on UK, USA, European countries, and I don't think it would necessarily be applicable. And I think, you know, what's the terms preparation and integration are already pretty modern Western constructs. Obviously, you know, stemming from set and setting, we now have preparation and integration, but many of the things we call preparation naturally occur in many cultures as they're kind of woven into the culture. There's not even the need to do these specific set aside 21-day digital meditation program, right? It's a relational thing. It's embedded into the practices they do every day. So I agree, it's very specific and not necessarily culturally relevant beyond these certain specific situations. And so I think more research would be needed, even if it's kind of survey-based research, to kind of understand more about what specific preparation practices people are already doing, not necessarily what they wish they'd done.
It would be interesting to run it again.
Yeah,
Culture.
just the exact same interview schedule. I think it could be done easily. Yeah.
I would hazard a bet. I see your point about the cultural bias, but I kind of have a feeling that underneath meditation is like universal meta-awareness. With this kind of a bit more restricting, you know. And this preparedness could kind of tap into that kind of construct beforehand, and then we can develop it. If that makes sense. You know what I mean?
I do. I'm not wholly persuaded on that.
No, that. I was going to ask a quick question related to that actually, because I was really interested in the compassion from what is it media about. Could you elaborate on that? I didn't quite understand it.
Sorry, say that again. I couldn't hear.
I think part that came out of the top media, was it? Yeah, loving kindness.
Loving kindness, yes.
It was going to be mentioned in the federal interest in that part. Can you just elaborate on that finding?
Yeah, so this wasn't my finding. This was, I can put up the, where is it? Is it here? Yes, I think it's in the Diner paper. This hedonic treadmill, essentially many interventions temporarily increase your level of wellness or your positive affect. But more often than not, they can return back to baseline after kind of going back into your life. It kind of wears away. The same is true for psychedelics for many people. You kind of have the experience and then eventually you come back to baseline. These authors suggest that actually through loving kindness meditation, it slowly increases that baseline, even when you're not practicing. And so it mitigates this idea of kind of coming back to the baseline, because each time it slowly ramps up in a staircase fashion. I don't know if that's 100% true. It could just be one finding from a certain longitudinal paper, but I just like the phrase of the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah, no, it's just a little bit of what Andy was saying as well. I mean, because I suppose it alludes a little bit to what you were saying at the very beginning when you were done, that it might not actually really matter what we're doing. If in Gabon, the survey would have said it was great, but I would have liked to do a bath first, and here it says it was great, but more meditation or something like that. And you could imagine that maybe in some other completely whatever place, it would be something that we can't even imagine that people would want, right? And coming back to the whole sort of like, is meditation universal? Well, it depends on what we mean by meditation, right? What does that actually mean? Is it just a sharpening of mind? Is it focusing on love? Is it a directedness kind of thing? I suppose what I'm getting to is like, do you think that maybe it is a thing, like what you said, like maybe it really doesn't matter what it is we do, as long as it kind of, even if it's journaling, you know, journaling about your attention, like as long as it's directed towards the experience somehow.
Yeah, I think there's I can't remember if it's Hart, Godson or McCroy, but they're talking about the Santa Daime rituals as part of the preparation. Obviously, for many ayahuasca cultures, there's a very intense form of preparation. And one of the comments is it's not necessarily about the specific components, but rather the kind of it's the intention, the discipline, the commitment to this time frame. It's not really that important necessarily sometimes what specific components are within it. That's obviously one commentary. I'm sure many people would say it's absolutely important. These are the specific ways in which we must do it. But there's a variety across different cultures. And I do think there's something to be said about this time commitment, right? And that's kind of why I wanted to include the control, because if we just had the meditation and it showed an effect versus none of that, it could just be because spending 21 days, like we were saying, doing anything is useful. So at least by having the music control, if there is an effect, if there isn't an effect, that's even more interesting, I think. So it's a win-win for the final chapter. Leo?
So there's a group in Canada that they do research with and practice of group therapy, and told me that they're doing like few weeks of group therapy before the session. And he told me something quite interesting. Is that the more effort as a facilitator you put in the preparation of the group, the more you need to put less on the integration, because the group is already cohesive and it's kind of runs its own integration, and you don't really need to facilitate any integration because there's actually already a community that was really prepared in advance. And I was thinking from that, it was like, it was kind of an interesting thought about how we a lot of times think about preparation as preparation for the experience, but it's actually a lot of times preparation for the integration. Like it is preparing us to what would come after. If we develop a meditative practice, then we continue with the meditative practice after the experience. And it's not just about the preparation for an experience, it's the preparation for the whole process that comes after as well. And I wonder if you've had any thoughts on this, or you heard it from like, or you saw that kind of like people simply just continue with the meditation afterwards. They develop a practice, and it's all just like a really holistic thing.
Definitely. And I think if we think about, where is it? This thing, I think there should be another arrow, kind of the post state, rather than just the long-term outcomes, and how these pre-states influence both of them. Because learning these skills beforehand, because the actual psychedelic experience probably for many people have reported it changes that skill, at least having that foundational skill beforehand will become incredibly useful for the integration. But I also think even above just kind of those specific tools and skills being used, a big part of the preparation process in that final week is spending at least 7 days preparing for the integration. So even if it's not a specific skill that is trained and then honed and then changed throughout the process, even spending time sort of scheduling what you're going to do after, creating the networks, creating the like who you're going to call, what kind of practices you're going to do beforehand is a huge part of preparation. So preparing for integration is kind of the final stage of preparation. And I think failure to do that, it doesn't render the entire preparation meaningless, because obviously you have those skills that you're potentially refining and then being able to implement, but it definitely takes it to the next level of being like, okay, now you feel more, it's almost like you can't really ever complete the preparedness, but at least it's almost the final chapter of saying, now you can take it. It's like, even on a small level, if you were preparing a trip at home, if you haven't quite like done the dishes or prepared some food for after, it doesn't quite feel like you're ready and prepared to do it. So I think it's about cleaning the dishes and making the food beforehand.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, and thank you for doing this huge work. What I found very interesting was the aspect that people do, and looking through the lens for existential stuff. Things like loving kindness, so this friendliness, but that it makes sense that this kind of approach can counteract maybe the feelings of existential threat, and that the sense of humor is a great thing. They're also thinking about this absurdity of the inconsistency of experience and taking advantage for the destabilization effects of how your worldview is taken. So I wonder if you thought, or what you think about mapping these different aspects of what's helpful to specific challenges.
Definitely don't have data on it, but I think that's the next step, right? So we had this broad band meditation's good for the experience. Now we're looking at what specific aspects are good for these experiences. And I think the next question is, okay, in addition to, this idea of enhancing oceanic boundlessness, what protective aspects of that meditative practice might counteract the challenging experiences? I haven't done that research, but I think it would be super, super cool. And we should definitely speak about it.
Yeah, so I just want maybe okay. If you can bring it back to the bench. So I just wanted to add to the whole conversation, think about it, because like I practice a lot. I'm an advanced meditator, and when we talk about why we practice metta for this kind of thing, would be because when you go into a mystical state or unitive state experience, what you're going to feel is unity. You're going to feel oneness with all things, and that the feeling of that is so when you, it's like going backwards. So when you prepare for metta, like when you practice it, then you're much more open to the unitive state experience, and then it's not this shock. It's not a logical shock to the system. So that's why it's the most important one. And when you cultivate it in the integration, you slowly stabilize that. So that's why metta would be the most interesting. But coming back to what Andy and Jones were talking about, it is, when I've spoken to these monks about it, they always say in terms of cultural differentiation, these monks, they live, who are practicing meditation every day, they live in a very different state of consciousness. So whenever they also say that if you really want to study this, you have to study this from the Western perspective. You shouldn't study it from here, because it's like you go into our brains, and for us it's the same. It's like if you're living in India, it's like asking in India, what's India? You can't know it. You have to see it from the outside in. And so these are just different states of consciousness we are entering. But it's much more interesting when we enter them from an outside perspective rather than an inside perspective. That's why it's very important for us to practice it. That we are saying that we should practice it. Well, so that what I mean to say is that I think it should be very specific. The meditations to psychedelics. And there should be different meditations, specific ones, not the ones that you can't completely contextualize. And that's the whole sort of job of the next stage of meditation.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think it isn't about kind of replicating those states, not necessarily. I think it shouldn't, that's why we're not calling it metta, right? It shouldn't be called specifically metta. It's something else based on some of those ideas from that training to help facilitate these experiences. And I think one of the issues we face, especially, I completely agree, there's some benefit from studying it from the outside potentially, if done correctly, but there's also the limitation of maybe like reducing it to something that it really isn't. So I think metta has become super popular. Everyone knows what metta is, but when I was speaking to these practitioners last week, it has to be contextualized within so many other practices, whether it's the 4 immeasurables or any other kind of practice. Metta alone may not actually be the most useful approach. It may have to be balanced with other types of practice as well, whether that's kind of compassion or joy or equanimity. Just practicing metta alone, I think, could be useful, but I think it's also important to have that education around what other people have known for many, many years, right? Rather than something. Exactly.
Yes, it's very interesting.
Very cool. I would love to chat more about that.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the natural language processing that you did in the Roberta model. What kind of tests did you use to validate it beforehand and afterwards? And then a separate point as well, it's some amazing figures now. We'd love to know what program you use.
So figures, Python, easy, I made those. Natural language processing, I can contact you with Jo from our lab, who's like the natural language processing whiz. So she's very much running those, and we're kind of discussing them together. I don't know the specific details on those, but I could definitely, she'd love to chat about that in more very specific details. Okay, perfect.
Hi. So I think somebody brought up your cultural background and how that might affect how you perceive the meditation process, right? So I was wondering if in your preparation stage, did you include any part where you understood every individual's religious beliefs and religious orientation and how it could better your experience with the psychedelic? And that you accepted or not? Was there any part in your preparation stage?
So we do always collect quite a vast amount of demographic data. These studies so far, I haven't included them or explored them specifically, but in the study that we're about to run, we'll also collect all of that data. But at the moment, I haven't explored any of that, but we have that data if that's something you're interested in looking at. But I'm sure there is something to be said there, obviously. But yeah, I haven't looked at it.
And that kind of would prepared the questionnaires. What was like the most surprising thing that came that you didn't expect? You know, when people mentioned that it's important in preparation, or a surprising tension of things that we did not reach consensus or something. Was there anything that I know? Yeah.
I honestly did this like I can't remember what would be most surprising from the Delphi, but I could definitely find that answer. I think, to be honest, just as a very basic level, I found it really surprising that after 2 rounds, it suddenly ramped up again. I thought through the Delphi, we would like refine because of the preliminary interviews of the experts. I thought we had like the majority of items, but after the second round, there were even more. So then I kind of had that feeling of, oh my gosh, brilliant. We're going to have a million of things to kind of include within the actual item reduction analysis. And then it pruned down again. So it was almost, I knew we would have 4 rounds. Sorry, I didn't even know we'd have 4 rounds. We were going to have the rounds until like majority consensus would be met. So after the second round, I think I probably thought this is kind of going to last forever if we kind of have this many now. And I wasn't quite sure how it was going to run. So that's kind of one memory, but honestly, it was at the beginning of my PhD. I can't remember specific items. I don't know.
Considering that the vast majority of psychedelic use is still recreational, how much of these findings from like clinical settings or retreats do you think would translate or recreational settings?
So I think, well, with the trial we're about to run, we're using healthy individuals. It's not a clinical trial. It's very much, it's a research setting, but it's for people who have never had much psychedelic experience or meditation experience, because we are interested in developing tools and interventions for people, not necessarily just clinical trials. The intervention itself is obviously quite intensive. 21 days of meditation. Many people won't say, I'm going to do this before Glastonbury. But so it's not necessarily like a pre-festival prep package, but it isn't designed to just be used within research settings. It should be, we want to make the conversation, if you have an upcoming psychedelic experience, whether it's with friends, a retreat center, whatever, here's some validated tools that could be useful. So it's not necessary, it's actually not clinically informed. It's not for being designed or tested for clinical populations. That would actually probably require something more specifically clinically and like a guiding theoretical framework rather than just kind of this exploratory loving kindness. So I do actually think it has more possibility of being relevant for more recreational users than it does clinical populations. And with the earlier studies, the online study was very much pretty much recreational users. Most people, as you say, are recreational users. The retreat center collaborations, it's kind of the halfway because it's not a clinical setting and many of them hadn't tried it before, but some had. So yeah, it's definitely not specifically just for recreation, but it's not super clinical.
Did they definitely do the meditation? Or was it all set up with the app?
So they haven't, no, definitely not. No one's done it yet. But we will be tracking absolutely everything. And they can't actually get to the next daily task, which is the journal, unless they finish the meditation. There's 3 tasks that they do every morning, which is meditation, journal, and a mood check-in. And they have to go through the whole meditation and I can track it. Huh? We really wanted to include wearables, but we don't have any money. So if you have any.
Last question.
I'm quite interested in people who might not have that much experience meditating, because that will probably be quite a good chunk of DIPP users at some point. Some people struggle to meditate as it is, and in 21 days, even that's not that long time to learn how to meditate, essentially. Do you think people that find it difficult to meditate, would that just predispose them to maybe a more challenging psychedelic experience?
That's a really interesting question. So the DIPP is actually designed for first-time meditators, maybe who I think our inclusion criteria is like less than 10 meditation sessions, less than 30 minutes. So really haven't tried it too much. So on one hand, it is for new meditators, but I guess also you can't tell if that's a person who's tried it loads and can't meditate. But every single script has been designed and kind of piloted with this meditation research group at Harvard. And it really teaches you how to meditate. It teaches you that finding meditation hard is part of meditation. Distractions are a part of meditation. It's really from the bare backbone. And so we thought about these things because many of the people we think who would be using it, we kind of assumed they would be bad at meditating and couldn't do it. So we tried as best as we can to make it as simple as possible. But we've also, with these mood check-ins, so they do the meditation every day, they have the journal, and then they have these mood check-ins. There's like a series of questions that not only tap into kind of their valence and arousal during that state, but also taps into how deep they went and how they experienced it. So we can track whether or not individuals who kind of were able to enter deeper states then had a deep, more oceanic boundless or whatever, different subjective experience, whereas those who were struggling slightly more, maybe that would be a predictor of a more challenging experience. So I think it's a super cool question to look at, and we will get the data to maybe start to be able to ask those questions. But that's a really good question.
So one more, I'm still starting out thinking a while. Do you think there's much of a difference between meditation and, say, attentional training? Like, to control it, if you're each other, do you think there's some similar shared thing or something different?
Well, I think attentional training could be a form of meditation, but it would be different from you can have different types, right? So you could have attentional training or a focused attention. You might be focusing on your breath, or maybe an attentional kind of brain training. I think it is used a lot in meditation controls, especially if you control it to something slightly more compassion-based or meta-based. You're looking at different kind of practices. So I think it really depends on the question and the design, but it also could be considered a form of meditation. Thanks.